At first, it looked like a simple loss of signal, just a blip on the map, a minor drop in communication that happened sometimes in the hills east of Yarmouk, where terrain swallowed transmissions and cloud cover played tricks on satellites. 2 Marine Scout snipers, designated Viper and Bishop, had been inserted with minimal gear, tasked with a 48-hour overwatch mission to monitor an expected convoy route. High ground, clear lines of fire, standard insertion and exfil timeline. The last message they sent was a range confirmation and 2 coordinates. After that, nothing. Command tried to raise them twice, then 4 times, then sent a drone. The footage showed smoke near their last known position. No movement. No thermal return. The assumption came quick. Compromised, possibly KIA. A loss, but an understandable one. The mission was quiet, the objective mid-value, and support teams were days away. The file was marked for review, and attention shifted to the next op. What no one knew was that the 2 snipers weren't dead. They were buried, not under rubble, under dirt, under silence. They had seen the first round arc in, the mortar dropping faster than they could warn anyone. It had hit just 30 meters wide of their OP, throwing shock and stone, but not death. What followed was worse. A blackout in communication, drone jamming, then the tightening of a circle they didn't know they'd stepped into. For the next 72 hours, Viper and Bishop did not move from their hill. They did not request extraction. They did not run. They stayed in place, bodies lowered into the ground, wrapped in camouflage and surrounded by growing numbers of enemy fighters who knew they were up there, but not exactly where. Every breath was calculated. Every shift in weight had to be silent. Every round counted, not in dozens, but in single digits. They fought in pieces, in fragments. They used every inch of terrain, every ounce of training. The enemy came in waves. Spotters first, then infantry squads, then mortar teams, drone passes, and finally a full platoon-sized element sweeping the ridge in staggered formation. Still, the 2 snipers held. They fired with purpose, not panic. When their rifles fell silent, they used knives. When knives dulled, they used the terrain. They became the hill itself, unmoving, untraceable, yet lethal. By the end of day 3, most command elements believed the team lost. The only hint of survival came from overhead. A lone drone pass caught flashes on the ridge that didn't match enemy movement. A heat signature too cold to be human, too steady to be nature. They sent a ping. It was answered. Not with a message, but with 2 rounds fired in unison, clean, synchronized, from the hill. It wasn't confirmation of survival. It was a warning. We're still here. The insertion was quiet, as it was meant to be. No lights, no radio traffic, no unnecessary chatter. Just the rhythmic thump of rotors above a landscape soaked in shadows and cold wind. The bird came in low over the eastern ridgelines of Yarmouk province, 30 miles from any known forward operating post. The sky was still black, a few hours before dawn, and the only illumination came from the faint green glow of instrument panels and the diffused moonlight dancing on the curved glass of night vision goggles. Viper and Bishop sat silent against the bulkhead, rifles across their chests, eyes fixed forward, not from nerves, but from focus. They had done this before, more than once. The prep was always the same. The difference this time wasn't the target. It was the silence surrounding it. There was no chatter from intel, no thermal scans, no drone eyes, just a high-value corridor suspected of being reopened by enemy logistics crews. Command wanted eyes. They sent the best they had. They hit the ground just past 0300, 20 clicks northeast of their objective hill. It was too risky to land directly on the site, so they would hike it in. Minimal loadouts, reduced infrared signature, double muffled footsteps. Everything designed to keep them invisible. The landscape was open, broken terrain. A mix of exposed shale ridges, thickets of dying scrub, and long stretches of dry riverbed that had once carved the land but now served as wind tunnels and echo chambers. Every step crunched, every breath steamed in the cold air. They moved without speaking, pausing only to check elevation markers and confirm position using triangulated points mapped out 2 days earlier. By 0410, they reached the base of the hill, a wide, bald rise with a crown of cracked boulders and loose soil. Not ideal, but nothing in this region ever was. What made it valuable was its elevation. From the top, they had direct overwatch on a stretch of road known as Highway 6, a narrow winding corridor used intermittently by convoys moving gear and fuel west to east. The hill gave them 270 degrees of open sight line, with little to no cover but plenty of natural concealment if used correctly. And in their line of work, concealment was more valuable than armor. They moved up the slope carefully, every footfall calculated. The wind was starting to pick up, and with it came the first taste of static electricity in the air, a sign of weather moving in. They welcomed it. Clouds were good. Clouds meant no drone coverage. Clouds meant the enemy would hesitate to fly. Clouds meant sound traveled shorter. Sightlines were blurred. But it also meant visibility would be a challenge. They needed to build their hide sites quickly, efficiently, and with redundancy. At the crest, they split left and right, marking their positions on a shared wrist pad and beginning to dig. The soil was loose but mixed with stone, slowing the process. They carved 2 shallow depressions, one for primary cover and another for fallback. Each hole was layered with camouflage netting, shredded burlap, and bits of the surrounding terrain. They used dust-colored shemmegs and fragments of local vegetation to break up the outline. Once dug in, they unpacked optics, cleaned their rifle bolts, checked barrel alignment, and zeroed each scope manually using known distance markers in the valley below. Viper took the southern slope, locking down the road and the western rise. Bishop took the northeast, tasked with overlapping the eastern side and monitoring the trail leading in from the hills. Between them, they had a full sector covered, and more importantly, no visible silhouette. Their bodies were buried under earth, only the barrels of their rifles extended a fraction beyond the netting. Motion sensors were placed around the hilltop at variable distances, some close, others farther out, each programmed to ping through vibration and ground contact, rather than infrared. They couldn't afford to leave thermal footprints. The first 4 hours were uneventful. A convoy moved through the lower corridor. A single technical, 2 cargo trucks, no escort. They logged it, didn't engage. That wasn't their purpose. Their role was to observe, confirm, relay. Target acquisition would be decided later. Still, both men tracked the vehicles silently through their scopes, watching how the drivers handled the curves, whether anyone dismounted, if they followed known patterns. They did. All routine, all forgettable. Until the last truck stopped briefly near the base of the ridge. It paused too long. No dismount, no visible breakdown. Just a halt. Then a slow roll forward. Bishop noted it. So did Viper. Neither acted. Not yet. It could have been a coincidence. Could have been fatigue. Could have been a signal. By nightfall, the temperature dropped 10 degrees. The sky was still overcast. The moon flickered behind low clouds. They took turns sleeping in 20-minute rotations, each man scanning the horizon before nodding off. They kept comms to an absolute minimum, just a short encrypted ping to confirm status at hourly intervals. At 21:12, the first irregularity occurred. Their ping failed to bounce back. They tried again. Still nothing. Static. No confirmation from forward command. At 21:27, the first mortar round hit. It landed 70 meters away, poorly aimed, likely a probe. The second came closer, 40 meters. Then 30. Then a cluster of 5 more in rapid succession. Dirt and rock lifted into the air around them. Their hides held. No direct impact. No compromise. But the pattern was clear. This was not a random strike. They didn't speak. They didn't move, just waited. At 22:04, a drone passed overhead. Small, quadrotor. Civilian built. Infrared capable. It hovered for less than a minute before turning east. They didn't fire. Couldn't risk it. From then on, movement in the valley increased. Headlights flickered at the edges of the kill zone. The hill was no longer anonymous. Someone knew it mattered. And someone had told them to clear it. By midnight, the mission had changed. They were no longer observers. No longer temporary shadows watching movement from a safe distance. They were alone. Surrounded, and preparing to become something else entirely. The wind shifted again as the last mortar detonated below the northern slope, carving out a crater where Viper had moments earlier repositioned a decoy heat pad. Dirt and stone rained down in a light scatter, more like a warning than an attack. The blast wasn't close enough to damage their hides, but it was a message, unmistakable in intent. The enemy wasn't firing blindly anymore. They were bracketing, adjusting, trying to land the next one closer. In silence, both snipers readjusted, checking their bolt assemblies and flicking sweat from their brows despite the cold. Every muscle tensed in a way that no longer felt like fear, but calculation. They knew the game had begun. The night pressed in tighter after that. Without moonlight and under heavy cloud cover, the ridgeline disappeared into pitch black. Even the valley below dimmed into a blur of motionless shapes. Optics struggled to track heat as ambient temperatures dropped to match human signature. Every breath fogged up glass for a fraction too long. They slowed their breathing, adapted, recalibrated. Time unraveled. 10 minutes became 30. An hour passed in near total stillness. Then sound returned. Not from above, but below. The crunch of gravel. The deliberate footfall of men trying not to be heard. Viper caught the pattern first. 6 distinct sets of boots, spaced apart, moving in 2 groups of 3 along the western slope, working their way uphill with alarming precision. He resisted the urge to shift position. Instead, he rotated the optic slightly, counting the seconds between steps. Whoever was coming knew how to move. The spacing, the rhythm, the angle. They weren't locals or militia. These were trained fighters, possibly recon, possibly special security elements embedded with whatever force had taken an interest in this hill. They weren't firing. They weren't probing with flashlights or drones. They were advancing on foot in near total silence, hoping to flank a position that shouldn't have been occupied anymore. At 0138, one of the enemy squads paused, then the other. There was no command, no whisper, just the shared instinct of men moving tactically, synchronizing without words. Viper had seen this before. In training, in Afghanistan, in places not found on maps. He knew what was coming. He waited. One man broke off and continued up alone, climbing higher than the others. He moved too confidently, passing over one of the small reflective markers the snipers had placed earlier. His boot brushed it. It didn't make a sound. But it shifted. That was enough. The momentary pause in his stride, the subtle tilt of his head downward, betrayed his awareness. He'd seen it. He knew. Viper's finger tensed on the trigger, but he didn't fire. Instead, he keyed a silent signal, 3 blinks on his wrist light. Across the ridge, Bishop responded with a single green pulse. Both waited. The enemy fighter knelt, scanned the hill slowly, raised a pair of NVGs to his face, and began to sweep. That was his final movement. Viper fired once. The suppressed round struck center mass, high on the sternum. The man collapsed backward, hitting the slope with a quiet thud. His NVGs skidded several feet down the hill. The others didn't fire in return. They froze, waiting, unsure if it had been environmental noise or a shot. That hesitation cost them. Bishop fired next, 2 rounds in quick succession, targeting the opposite side of the slope where the second group had positioned. One went down instantly. The second scrambled and vanished into brush. No return fire, no shouting, only silence. What followed was a full hour of stillness. No movement, no sound. The only confirmation of kills came from thermal overlays. 2 cooling bodies, the third lost to terrain. The snipers didn't move from their positions. They didn't chase. Instead, they repositioned slightly, shifting firing angles and rechecking sectors. At 0305, a low drone passed overhead. Smaller than before, possibly hand-launched. It scanned in a lazy zigzag, attempting to pick up heat signatures or visual cues, but the snipers were buried under layers of insulation and natural cover. Their rifles extended only inches beyond the dirt. Their faces were veiled with mesh. The drone passed and continued east. No flare, no return sweep. They had avoided detection again. But the game had changed. At 0337, a second wave approached. This time from the north face, steeper terrain, less direct. 2 figures advanced together, slowly, cautiously, not as disciplined, likely fresh replacements or less experienced militia. One carried a flashlight, beam low, cutting arcs across the ground. The other had a short-barreled rifle and moved with uncertainty, scanning too high and too fast. Bishop waited until they were 30 meters from the fallback hole. Then he fired twice. The flashlight blinked out. The second figure screamed once before silence swallowed the sound. The scream was a mistake. Within minutes, the hill lit up. 6 mortars landed in staggered succession, bracketing the known hide sites and hammering the upper slopes. Dust clouds obscured optics. Shrapnel tore into the surrounding rock. One fragment nicked Bishop across the shoulder, slicing through his pack but missing bone. He packed it with gauze, didn't speak, didn't flinch. They held position. By 0430, wind returned, thick with grit. Visibility dropped again. The night resumed its earlier rhythm. Darkness, silence, tension. They took turns sleeping. 20 minutes per rotation. One rested while the other watched. No dreams. Only the weight of waiting. At 0502, the final contact of the night occurred. 3 fighters, likely unaware of earlier casualties, began climbing from the southern gully. They moved faster, less coordinated. Possibly a rushed team sent to confirm kill. They carried no support weapons, just rifles, sidearms, and backpacks. One had a radio. Viper waited until all 3 were within 50 meters. He fired once. The shot took the lead man through the throat. The others dove for cover, but Bishop was already watching from his new angle. 2 clean shots followed. Silence returned. By first light, the bodies were barely visible. Black shapes at odd angles in the gray pre-dawn haze. The wind flattened the hill again. The comms were still dead. The sat-link hadn't returned. The drone overhead was silent. No extraction notice, no uplink confirmation. They hadn't eaten. They were down to 1.5 liters of water, 2 MREs, and 43 rounds between them. The hill had been quiet for an hour, but they both knew the quiet never meant safety. It just meant the next wave was waiting. By sunrise, the wind had calmed, but the tension hadn't. The light creeping over the eastern ridgeline didn't bring clarity. It only exposed the scars of the night before. The upper slopes of the hill were now pockmarked with shallow craters, the dirt blackened and sprayed with shattered rock. Shrapnel glinted faintly in the dust. The once unbroken curve of the rise had been peeled open in places by the mortar strikes, revealing exposed patches of the earth that made concealment harder. Yet Viper and Bishop remained invisible, buried in spider holes beneath carefully reconstructed netting and a thin skin of terrain. From a distance, they were part of the hill, as lifeless and natural as the stones around them. Their bodies ached from the stillness, muscles beginning to cramp from hours without movement. Every inch of their gear was coated in grime, the damp air seeping through seams and fabric. Their hands were raw, eyes dry, throats parched, but none of that mattered. The moment the first figure appeared again on the lower slope, all discomfort was overwritten by cold, functional clarity. The enemy had returned. This time, it wasn't small teams or probing recon. It was a full-scale maneuver element. 2 squads of roughly 8 to 10 men each, moving in disciplined bounds up the western and southern faces of the hill. No more stealth. No more hesitation. These were fighters with orders and a time frame. They wanted the hill cleared before noon, and they intended to do it by overwhelming presence. From their vantage points, Viper and Bishop could see everything. The staggered spacing, the use of terrain for cover, the hand signals passed between fireteam leaders. These weren't civilians with rifles. They were trained, possibly contractors, possibly remnants of a foreign-trained militia. It didn't matter. What mattered was the way they moved, cautious but direct. Their rifles were up. They were expecting contact, and they were ready to trade lives for position. Viper adjusted his magnification, watched through the scope as a team leader raised his hand and signaled a halt. The man turned, whispered to his flank, pointed toward a shadowed section of boulders 20 meters up. A sniper hide, maybe, or where they thought one would be. That's when Viper fired. 1 round center mass, just below the clavicle. The man dropped mid-step, legs folding, rifle tumbling out of reach. The shot echoed once, suppressed but sharp in the morning stillness. Instant reaction followed. The fighters fanned out, one firing blindly into the brush above, another diving for cover, and radioing a burst transmission in short, encrypted chirps. Bishop took the next shot, dropping a second figure mid-sprint. The group stalled, then tried to flank left, toward the low ridge near the old mortar craters. Another mistake. They had pre-sighted the area the night before, mapping every depression, every corner that might offer concealment. Bishop fired again, hitting a third target just as he crouched behind a slab of stone. The man screamed once, then went quiet. The others hesitated, pinned now by an enemy they couldn't see and couldn't locate. The Marsoc snipers continued the rhythm. Fire, relocate, observe, repeat. They never fired from the same position twice. Every shot came from a different angle. Every muzzle flash, minimal as it was covered by movement and time to enemy transitions. It made them seem like more than 2, like a full squad. Psychological warfare by precision. After the first 10 minutes of engagement, the hill was still theirs. 7 enemy dead, several more wounded and dragging themselves down the slope. Radio transmissions spiked, barely intercepted by Marlin-encoded earpieces. Frantic requests for confirmation, for permission to continue, for coordinates to call in indirect fire. But the snipers had already preempted that. They had shifted to fallback holes, rotated sectors. They knew exactly where the mortars would land, and they were no longer there. At 0920, a drone buzz returned. This one flew higher, out of small arms range, conducting slow orbits. Its presence wasn't immediate, its hum merged with wind and distant rotor echoes. But eventually they caught it. Thermal scans would likely pick up heat pockets, but not distinguish between targets. The snipers had countermeasures, cold packs, layered foil underlays, and body stillness that mimicked terrain. As long as they didn't move, they were ghosts. The next push came at 1,000. 2 squads again, from opposite flanks, supported this time by a technical vehicle with a mounted PKM, which parked at the bottom of the hill and laid down bursts of suppressive fire across the general slope. The rounds chewed into the soil, sending plumes of dirt skyward and blanketing the air with fine dust. Visibility dropped. This was their screen. Under cover of that chaos, one squad began climbing directly up the southern ridge. Bishop switched optics, scanning through the haze. He saw them, 5 shapes, hunched low, advancing in a staggered line. He held fire. Too early, too exposed. Let them climb. Let them tire. When the 5th man passed a pre-marked rock, the one they'd used as a distance marker, Bishop fired. 2 rounds, both hits. The line broke. The fighters ducked. One returned fire, wildly. Viper, from the western hole, angled his rifle and picked off the shooter mid-burst. The rest retreated, leaving behind the bodies. The technical tried to adjust, moving forward 10 meters, its gunner scanning wildly. They let it move. When the driver stepped out, possibly to mark a new firing line, Bishop shot him through the shoulder. The man spun and dropped. The vehicle halted. No one replaced him. At 10:40, the push ended. By 1100, the valley quieted again. The snipers took inventory. Between them, they had fired 47 rounds, 27 confirmed kills. No wounded on their side beyond Bishop's bandaged shoulder and a bruised rib from recoil absorption. Water was half gone. Food barely touched. Ammunition low, but not desperate. The hilltop smelled of smoke, gunpowder, and the faint copper of blood carried by the wind. They were exhausted, but they were still in control. And the enemy, despite every coordinated assault, still couldn't breach the top 20 meters. For now, the hill stood, because they stood on it. By noon, the sun was a hammer. It beat down through a thin sheet of overcast that did nothing to soften the heat. The wind had died again, leaving the air stagnant and thick with the smell of scorched earth, gunpowder, and blood drying on stone. The hill no longer looked like terrain. It looked like aftermath. The sandbags the snipers had partially buried to reinforce their hides had been shredded. Netting flapped loose like torn skin. The once clean contours of their positions had become a scarred mess of shallow craters, soot, and footprints, both theirs and others. Still, they stayed buried. Still, they watched. Neither Viper nor Bishop had slept in more than 24 hours. Micronaps stolen in rotation had done little more than delay the weight pressing behind their eyes. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their bodies worked through habit now, fingers adjusting optics, squeezing hydration bladders, clearing dust from chambers and optics with the dull repetition of men who knew the cost of slowing down. Bishop's shoulder bled intermittently from the shrapnel slice he'd taken in the early hours, but he had packed it twice with gauze and tape. Viper's right hand was swollen from absorbing recoil too hard with a damaged glove. He flexed it between shifts of the rifle, trying not to let it lock up. The radios remained dead. No pings, no signals, no friendlies. Airspace was silent except for the occasional drone pass. Farther apart now, lazier in its orbit. They'd likely assumed the hill was either cleared or burned beyond importance. That suited the snipers just fine. They were tired of being watched. Tired of calculating their body heat by the minute. Tired of wondering if the next insect sound was actually a quadrator's hum. But rest wasn't an option, because even as the attacks had stopped, the feeling hadn't. The presence. They knew they weren't alone. They could feel the tension on the edges of the slope like a wire pulled tight but not yet snapped. Somewhere beyond the ridgeline, fighters regrouped, reconsidered. Maybe arguing, maybe praying, maybe calling for someone to finish the job they couldn't. It didn't matter. The silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like the breath drawn before a scream. At 1317, Bishop spotted motion along the eastern face. Just a flicker. A glint. A low shape crawling slowly, belly to stone. Viper zeroed in. It wasn't one man, it was three, crawling in tandem, packs flat, rifles slung, trying to flank from the blind side using the trench they'd carved during the first night's engagement. Smart, silent, but not enough. Bishop didn't fire. He let them crawl, let them feel close, let them believe they'd gotten inside the wire. Only when the lead man was within 10 feet of the fallback position did he trigger the wire. The explosion was sharp, dry, localized. One body launched backward, arms flailing. Another rolled and tried to stand but was cut down by Viper's follow-up round. The third retreated, screaming in a language neither sniper understood, crawling blind with blood in his eyes. They didn't chase. They let him go, let him carry fear back down the hill. By then, the hilltop was half ash. The wind picked up again, hot and dirty, carrying with it the smell of burned canvas and fuel. Somewhere below, one of the vehicles destroyed in the morning push had reignited. Smoke curled up in twisting columns, thick and black, coating everything with a layer of soot. Their gear looked like it had been through hell. Bishop's scope had a crack on the edge of the lens from the last barrage. Viper's rear sight had come loose and been duct-taped back into place. Both of them looked like ghosts, faces streaked with dust and sweat, uniforms torn, packs lighter than they should have been. They were low on water. Food was untouched, but neither had the stomach for it. Their mouths were dry and sour. Their fingers trembled when they paused for too long. Still, they stayed alert. At 14:22, a second patrol appeared. This one larger. 12 men, staggered across the north slope, wearing mismatched uniforms but moving in loose formation. 2 carried RPGs. One had a belt-fed weapon across his chest. The others moved like infantry, rifles high, heads low. They weren't rushing. They were casing the approach, scanning for life, for movement, for resistance. They didn't find it. Not immediately. Because the snipers had gone deeper, buried into the last layer of their fallback trench, covered in tarp, netting, and dust, breathing through cloth soaked in water to hide thermal signature. They waited. Minutes passed. The team advanced. Up. Closer. One man knelt 5 feet from Viper's barrel, looked down, saw nothing, stood, kept walking. Then the trap closed. Viper rose, fired twice. Bishop followed. 2 dead instantly. The rest dove for cover, spraying wildly into the rocks, hitting nothing. Return fire lasted less than 60 seconds, then silence, then retreat. Bodies rolled back down the slope, still twitching. The others never returned. After that, there were no more attacks. Not because they had won, but because whatever force had come for them decided the hill wasn't worth it anymore. Too much blood, too many bodies, too many ghosts. The rest of the afternoon passed without sound, just the wind. The hill groaned under its own weight. Every inch of it carried memory now, spent brass, cratered dirt, the lingering heat of too many dead men. Viper adjusted his scope one last time. Nothing moved. Bishop dozed off for 7 minutes, then woke up sweating and coughing dust. No nightmares, just a deep void of black, like falling through the hill itself. At dusk, the temperature dropped again. They layered up with what was left, shared a few ounces of water, split 1 MRE, chewed without tasting. Still no comms, still no evac, still no signal from anyone on their side. But the hill was quiet. For the first time in 40 hours, the hill was breathing. So were they. Barely. But enough. By nightfall on the second day, the hill no longer felt like a location. It had become an extension of the snipers' bodies, a second skin composed of dirt, blood, smoke, and bone-deep silence. Viper and Bishop didn't just occupy ground anymore. They had fused with it, disappeared into it, absorbed its contours and edges until every stone and shallow depression served a purpose. They no longer moved with caution or calculation, but with the effortless synchronicity of men who had transcended the usual limitations of fear and exhaustion. Survival wasn't a conscious act. It was a condition of being. Their senses extended outward like roots through the soil. Every shifting breeze, every fragment of sound or tremor in the rock registered as if felt through skin. They were no longer fighting for position. They were defending a part of themselves. With the setting sun came another blackout in the sky. The drone that had circled intermittently for the past 12 hours vanished entirely. No infrared sweeps, no overhead buzz, just the endless hush of cold air pressing against the scorched slopes. The ridgelines darkened quickly, shadows spilling like oil across the valley below. Heat plummeted. The stone turned brittle underfoot. Still, No new attacks came. No squads. No scouts. The enemy was either gone or waiting for dawn. Viper didn't believe in the first. Bishop didn't care either way. They prepared for both. They rebuilt what was left of their camouflage in silence. What little netting hadn't burned or been shredded in the mortar blasts was sewn back together with paracord and wrapped in soot-soaked gauze to eliminate shine. They pressed it down with sand and flat stones, using their hands like trowels. Eyes barely open. They moved slowly, deliberately, with no waste of energy. The surface-level hides had been abandoned after the last contact. Their new positions were deeper, colder, and even harder to detect. They dug elbow-to-rib trenches, narrow enough to suffocate but wide enough to allow rifle movement. They laid into them like graves, chest to dirt, wrapped in mylar sheeting and shredded packs. Breathing through slits they carved in water filter mesh. No body heat escaped, no scent, no silhouette. They kept no lights, no signals, no wrist beacons, not even glow tape. If extraction came, it would have to find them by signature alone. Until then, they would not give the hill away. Because the moment they were seen, they would die. They both knew that, and they had not come this far to be seen. At 0100, light movement returned. Faint vibrations through the rocks. Not human this time. Drones, small, likely civilian grade, modified with thermal pods and motion sensors. The enemy had finally gone back to tech. Viper heard the motor buzz before he saw the shadow, dipping and weaving across the western slope like a lazy insect. He pressed lower into the dirt, barely breathing. The drone passed twice, hovered for a second longer than it should have, then drifted east. Nothing happened. Bishop stayed still until it was out of range, then blinked twice to force tears into dry eyes. At 0213, the ground trembled again, this time with more weight. Footsteps, soft but many. A squad, maybe two, returning to the hill, climbing in staggered intervals, using dead zones between known sniper angles. They were smarter now, wiser, but still too late. The snipers didn't engage. They let the patrols advance, tracking each figure with eyes and breath alone. If a shot presented itself, they held it. Ammunition was no longer for combat. It was for survival. Every round left was a promise to be broken only when the hill was about to fall. The enemy moved through in silence, occasionally pausing, scanning, pointing. They were searching, not attacking. Hunting for signs of life, for movement. But there was none. Only terrain. Only a mountain that had become unnatural in its stillness. The patrols passed through. They didn't look up again. At 0340, a final check of the perimeter yielded nothing. Even the motion sensors rigged with tripwires and fishing line, last-ditch analog alarms, remained undisturbed. No pressure, no tension. The air had turned flat, cold, indifferent. The kind of cold that doesn't just bite, but buries. Bishop tried to whisper something but stopped himself. His throat was dry beyond words. He blinked and returned to watching. His pulse barely registered. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because fear had been exhausted out of his body. What replaced it was purpose. By 0430, the hill was silent again. This time not from retreat or death, but from recognition. The enemy had stopped trying. Whether by command or consensus, they had abandoned the hill. The price had grown too high, the unknown too lethal. They would find another route, another position. Let the dead men keep their rocks. The snipers didn't move. They lay flat, rib cages rising slowly under pressure dressings, fingers half-curled around grips they hadn't released in days. The radios remained dead. The night remained long. But they had won. Not by killing, not by outgunning, but by disappearing so fully into their environment that even the will to kill them evaporated. They had become something else. Not ghosts, not predators. They had become the hill. And the hill was still here. At 0527, as the horizon began to bleed with the faintest hue of dawn, a low hum drifted across the ridge. Not mechanical, not wind, but something in between. Both snipers heard it, but neither moved. They didn't lift their heads, didn't adjust optics, didn't scan the ridgeline. They had trained for false hope before. That sound had been a prelude to a lot of things. An enemy quadcopter, an incoming technical, a badly tuned radio loop. So they waited, breathing shallow, muscles twitching beneath layers of dirt and cloth. Then it came again, lower this time, heavier, rotor wash, close. By 0532, the vibration had deepened into a steady thump. Dust lifted off the slope in small eddies. the sound of an approaching bird coming in fast and low over the valley. They still didn't rise, still didn't signal. If it wasn't friendly, movement meant death. If it was friendly, protocol said, wait for visual confirmation. At this point, neither of them had the energy to break protocol. They simply lay still and let the earth vibrate around them. Then a voice broke through the comms, jagged, layered in static, but real. A call sign neither had heard in almost 3 days, repeated twice. Viper blinked. Bishop closed his eyes for a second longer than a blink, almost in disbelief. The voice came again. A third time, clear enough now to cut through every doubt left in their skulls. They were being extracted. Viper shifted first, his body cracking audibly as he moved his shoulder for the first time in hours. His rifle stayed low, his eyes still scanning. Bishop rolled slightly onto his side, gritting his teeth against the pain in his arm and ribs. They signaled each other, almost reflexively. Not with hands, not with words. Just the smallest nod between two men who had learned to communicate without speaking. They began to move. The Black Hawk flared over the southern slope at 0540. Its nose tipped forward, side doors open, gunners scanning with their barrels already tracking the tree line below. Dust exploded outward as the skids hit dirt. The sun had just begun to rise fully, casting long orange shadows across the ridge. It was the first real light the snipers had seen in 72 hours. They blinked against it, faces hollowed and gray from dust, sunburn, and fatigue. Their bodies shook from the effort of standing, each movement jagged like misfiring signals between brain and bone. The lift zone wasn't marked. No flares, no IR strobe, nothing to identify them but heat signatures and the knowledge that two men were supposed to be there. The crew saw them the moment they emerged. Two shapes that looked more like pieces of the mountain itself, rising from the earth like ghosts. Their gear hung loose, rifles slung but ready, uniforms torn, faces unrecognizable beneath dirt and crusted blood. Neither ran. They didn't have the energy. They walked in slow, painful strides toward the open ramp. Each step dug into burned feet and swollen joints. Bishop was limping, favoring his left side, using the stock of his rifle as a crutch. Viper kept scanning until the last step into the bird. His eyes still dialed into the tree line, even as the medics reached out to pull them aboard. Once inside, they dropped. Not with ceremony, not with relief, just gravity and surrender. Their bodies folded against the bulkhead, weapons still across their laps, packs dropped but not removed. The medics moved quickly, checking vitals, cutting open sleeves and pant legs, applying IVs and pressure dressings without asking questions. One tried to speak, but neither sniper responded. There was nothing left to say. As the Black Hawk rose from the hill, rotors kicking up a storm of loose soil and debris, the slope below shrank in size but not in presence. The two men watched it fade through slitted eyes, still tracking every inch of ground as if expecting movement even now. But there was none. The hill remained still, empty, and theirs. Inside the bird, the wind roared through the open doors. The medic leaned close, adjusting the flow on Bishop's IV and checking the seal on Viper's shoulder dressing. Bishop had 3 cracked ribs, dehydration nearing acute, a minor concussion. Viper had a torn muscle in his hand, 2 partially detached fingernails, and blood loss from a dozen small wounds. Both had dangerously elevated cortisol levels. Both were on the edge of organ strain, but both were alive. And not just alive, they had endured, together. When they touched down at the forward operating base 40 minutes later, it was like returning from the dead. The landing zone was busy. Support crews, fuel trucks, medical teams waiting under a shaded tent. But everything felt muted, as if the 2 figures stepping off the helicopter weren't part of this world. They walked, not carried, refusing stretchers. They were assisted, but not lifted. Pride had long since burned away, but dignity remained. The medical staff cleared a path for them, not out of respect, but something deeper, something instinctual. Everyone knew what had just walked back into their world. Something ancient, something dangerous, something rare. Inside the infirmary, they were cleaned, checked, and logged. No ceremony, no awards, no cameras. Just 2 names, marked as returned. Debrief was postponed. Neither could speak clearly. Their voices were coarse and cracked. They drank water like it was ritual, 1 small cup at a time, as their hands trembled involuntarily. They slept in shifts, even now. One would wake every hour, scan the shadows of the tent, then go back under. For the first 2 days, neither of them removed their boots. Word spread slowly. Not officially, but through glances, through whispers, the kind that stick in war zones longer than reports. Two ghosts had returned from a hill no one expected them to survive. They weren't just soldiers now. They were something more. Men who had vanished into the dirt and refused to die. Weeks later, when satellite review and drone logs were analyzed, command confirmed the numbers. 42 confirmed kills, 2 destroyed vehicles, 4 repelled assaults, 0 support, no resupply, 2 men, 73 hours. But the hill wasn't listed as strategic. It was marked as non-essential terrain. No follow-up operation was scheduled. No occupation ordered. The hill was left alone. Because some ground, once defended with that kind of fury, belongs to the ones who survived it. And those 2 men had made the hill their own. Not by holding it, but by becoming it.